My experiences with school desegregation probably was shaped by my early experiences with attending segregated schools. I attended W. Yates and attic school during my elementary years, and eventually was one of 10 or 12 kids who integrated Paseo High School. I graduated from Paseo in 1965, and after college, one of the things that I wanted to do was to go back within the African American community and teach kids. I was influenced by my experiences in segregated schools, and I really wanted to do a better job of teaching kids and helping kids to have a much more relevant experience in terms of schooling in general. So I started as a 7th grade teacher in 1971 at C.A. Franklin School, and this was a time when 7th graders were housed in the elementary school. For the next several years, after teaching at C.A. Franklin for about 6 years, I became engaged with several different roles within the district. I was a career education coordinator, and that came about as a result of my teaching career education to my 7th graders. And when Missouri adopted the career education target, I was asked to become a career education coordinator and sort of help teachers integrate career education in terms of the curriculum. Shortly after that position, I served as a homeschool coordinator on special assignment, and this was during the voluntary desegregation plan, Plan 6C, which involved withdrawing attendance boundaries in the Kansas City area and busing African American students to outlying schools, these schools that bordered actually Independence. And so many of the African American kids were bused out to those schools. As a homeschool coordinator on special assignment, my role was to help ease the transition of the community and the faculty and staff with integration. So I was one of a team of individuals who conducted human relations training. We did training around cultural diversity, and it was an interesting kind of a time in terms of that. Shortly after that position, I served as a staff developer for the Kansas City, Missouri School District, and from that role, I became the effective schools coordinator in the district. That would have been around 1984, which was the start of the desegregation plan. So in 1985, with the court order desegregation plan, the project that I coordinated was the Effective Schools program, as well as a high school program called School Within a School. So those two programs became remedial targets as a way of working with improving achievement for kids in the district. For instance, in the Effective Schools program, I initially coordinated that program through training with, providing training with teachers and coordinating some of the efforts around school programming for the lowest achieving schools in the district. We started with 6. With the advent of the DSEG plan, that program was expanded to 18 low achieving schools. Unbeknownst to me, because I was not involved with that decision, I found myself with a much larger group of individuals in terms of coordinating some of the school improvement efforts within that school. And these were the schools that were basically called the traditional schools. And these schools were never going to be integrated. They did not have the same amount of attention that the magnet schools had in terms of the improvements, overall improvements in the district, and they had less money. they actually became known as the Black Quarter schools, in that they were, again, they were never going to be integrated. And so it was a time within the district where the traditional schools became known as the have-not schools, and the magnet schools became known as those who have. And so there was a lot of resentment towards the attention, the lack of attention given those traditional schools. Well, I talked about Plan 6C. That was one of the very first efforts in terms of redrawing those boundaries and busing kids to outlier schools that were close to suburban areas. For instance, in Independence, there were several schools that were outside the independent school districts, and those were our schools. And so students were bused to those schools. So one-way busing occurred at that time. And then with the court-ordered desegregation in 1985, there was a big emphasis on magnet schools, improving the facilities in Kansas City. So lots of money went into the development of those magnet schools and approving attendance, not approving, improving facilities. And so that was the big emphasis in terms of those efforts. My role, again, was, especially for Plan 6C, was to help ease that transition in terms of integration. We often had training sessions with community members. I can recall that in many of those training sessions, parents did not really want the black kids bused to those schools, and so they would often sit in those meetings sort of with their backs turned towards us, and so there was lots of friction in terms of early integration around those particular areas. In terms of the implementation of the magnet schools and improvement of facilities, I can recall in 1985, one of my first assignments was to work with outside consultants in terms of enhancing existing what I would call magnet themes within the district. For instance, Voker had a science magnet theme, and Swinney also had a magnet theme. And so some of the early training early on was to enhance those themes within those two schools as a way of attracting whites back to the district. As special projects coordinator, I provided lots of training to those 18, initially the 6 lowest elementary schools in the district. With the advent of desegregation, as I mentioned earlier, the project was expanded to 18 low achieving elementary schools. And so my role was to provide training in those 18 schools. We had, in the 6 schools, did a lot to raise achievement among the 6 elementary schools. And so the larger charge was to also do a similar kind of programming with the 12 additional schools. But what was interesting, we were not given any additional money to do so. For me, I felt some resentment because I was not provided any input in terms of these schools all of a sudden becoming one of the remedial targets as a way of improving achievement within the district. And so I was never consulted about the program being expanded. I think that in the district there was this sense of kind of a hierarchical kind of a planning, lots of outside consultants coming in, and oftentimes administrators at the central office level, as well as administrators within schools, were not consulted with or given an opportunity to provide input in terms of the direction of the district should go in terms of that plan, especially as it related to programming at the school level. I think the feelings were somewhat mixed in the community for a number of reasons. First, the traditional schools receive less funding than the magnet schools. And as I mentioned earlier, these schools became known as the Black Quarter schools in that they were never going to be integrated. And so they were sort of the set-aside schools. And so there was lots of resentment among the teachers and the administrators in terms of the schools and the lack of attention that they were given. The phrase the have-nots was basically coined for these particular schools. Then secondly, there was resentment about the cab rides provided to white students coming from the suburbs. Lots of money was spent in terms of bringing kids in from the suburbs, and so there was much resentment on the part of people within the district about those cab rides. So eventually, when the money stopped, then those students went back to their home schools, and so that began to affect integration, or the level of integration, and I think that people basically resented that in terms of the community. In other words, these students would not have come to our schools if they had not been provided transportation. And then the other area of resentment was that ratio of 60-40 for determining the extent to which the school was deemed as integrated. And the reason why it was resentment in terms of that 60-40, because it meant that only 60% of the seats within a school were held by Black students, and then 40% those seats were held for white students. And sometimes students who lived in the neighborhood close to those schools could not have a seat in those schools. What was interesting, the earlier target was a 50-50 target, which was really hard to achieve, and so it later became 60-40 with the intent that if a school had 60% children of color and 40% non-minority, then it was deemed integrated. So lots of resentment in that area. I think initially they were excited about the magnet school plans. They were excited about the opportunity to improve their buildings, but as the target for integrating those schools dimmed, then their attitudes dimmed as well. I think there was a sense of defeat in terms of integration, that with all that had been done in Kansas City, that those schools were not going to be integrated. As I mentioned earlier, the resentment of educators within the traditional schools that resentment was pretty apparent. These educators felt that they were sort of second-class citizens, that their schools did not receive as much attention or as much money as the themed schools did. And so I would describe in terms of the community that there were really pretty much mixed feelings about school integration and whether or not we were going to really be able to achieve it. I believe that this was a neglected area, that not much attention was given to how students were really experiencing integration. I left the district in 1987 and later was contacted by Dorothy Shepherd, who was the principal of Paseo Performing Arts at that time. and she was interested in looking at or becoming much more aware as to how black and white students within that school were experiencing school integration. You know, what were their attitudes? How did they get along? Did friendships develop, etc.? So I did an interview study with about 35 to 40 kids at Paseo. And one of the a quote from one of the young men, one of the white students that I interviewed, sort of still stays with me today. And I think it exemplified what was happening in many of those schools in terms of kids learning to come together, to learn from each other, and really developing some lifelong friendships. He said, and this is a quote that I pulled out from the study that I have kept all these years. He said, "I always heard that this was a school of unity and everyone is accepted. But when you get here, you're here for a while and you interact with different people. You realize that there is a place that you're supposed to be. I was expected to hang out with whites because I was white." And so he talked about the lack of interaction between white and black students in the cafeteria. White students sat with white students, Asian students sat together, and black students sat with black students. And so there was not a lot of attention in terms of what the experiences were really like for kids within those newly integrated buildings. I was able to communicate some of those findings to the teachers and staff at the school, and they began to work to try to change some of that and find ways to get kids together more in terms of after-school activities, clubs, much more integrated kinds of activities. Well, I certainly felt that during the time that I was there that I worked with schools to contribute to integration. You know, for instance, Plan 6C, my role there as the homeschool coordinator on special assignment gave me the opportunity to provide human relations training to communities where the kids were being bused into. We provide training around cultural diversity and helping people sort of understand differences. In many of those trainings, we sometimes were not welcome because it was clear that the community was not really excited about black kids being bused into their schools. And so that was one way of contributing. And as I mentioned that I had the opportunity to conduct some of the activities similar to the interview study that I conducted at Paseo Academy in terms of looking at student experiences with school integration. I maintained, while I was at the regional labs, I was able to maintain contact with Kansas City schools and conducted a lot of the staff development, continue to conduct staff development in many of the traditional schools, specifically working with CHIC, which was an African-centered school, and that was their theme. So I did a lot of training within that area. When I returned to the district in 1996 as the assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, at that time the district was in the process of developing a transition plan towards unitary status. So I was charged with working with teachers, making sure that that team of teachers also included union teachers to develop an instructional improvement plan. We developed a safe schools plan and an accountability plan. And so these were plans that were basically remedial targets ordered by the court as a way of transitioning to unitary status. as I mentioned, at that time in 1984, I was a staff developer coordinator, and then I coordinated the Effective Schools program, which eventually became one of the programs for working with the traditional schools that, again, were never going to be integrated. And in my experience, many of the efforts were guided by outside consultants that came in. I witnessed and experienced times when even administrators at the central office, as well as school leaders in those buildings, were not asked for their input. And it seemed to be a much more kind of a hierarchical plan guided by not only the courts, but outside consultants and experts that came into the schools to sort of guide what was going on. You had the Desegregation Monitoring Committee that was responsible for making sure that the district achieved the targets that they had set. And I think that the monitoring committee was rather intimidating to schools. Sometimes administrators as well at the central office, as well as school leaders, were called in and questioned about the implementation of the plan and their targets and what they were doing. So it was just not a lot of collaborative kinds of efforts in terms of improving not only improving attendance and improving achievement, as well as increasing the integration within those schools. You know, there were always pockets of success in the district. And even during this period, and eventually with the district losing its accreditation in 2012, there were always, again, pockets of success. However, for most students, the achievement did not improve in the district. Improving student achievement was the aim of those remedial targets that were basically set up by the courts for the transition plan. And so at the end of desegregation, which began about 1996, the district was charged with finding ways to improve achievement. And as a result of that charge, I was involved with developing those plans, the instructional improvement plan. We were involved in curriculum alignment and several kinds of efforts in terms of making sure that as the district transitioned to unitary status, that there were really some targets for improving achievement. Overall, for most students in the Kansas City, Missouri School District, achievement did not happen for them. Improved achievement did not occur. Well, there was just no doubt in my mind that integrated schools lead to improved community and social relationships, helping individuals work in integrated settings, diversity of thought and actions, understanding individual differences and cultural differences. And I often believe that, and this was one of the sayings that I learned over the years through my work, that you learn more from people who are different than you than people who are like you. So in terms of the Kansas City communities, until we have integrated communities, I don't believe that we will ever be able to achieve integrated schools. So it starts with integrated communities. Improve community and social relationships, learning about different people, being prepared to work in integrated settings. I think all of those things are needed for young people to be prepared for working in a more integrated society, so that those social outcomes are always there in terms of integrated settings. And research has shown over and over again that students, both black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever the race or ethnicity, that they all benefit from integrated settings. A lot of my work has focused on the social context of schools and learning to listen to what kids have to say. I believe that if we stop and listen to what kids have to tell us, that they can tell us what they need individually to improve outcomes for them. But oftentimes we fail to listen to what they have to say. So I think that we need to find ways to listen more to kids, to provide them much more opportunities for student governance, and not just focusing on those students that are doing well, but students at every level in terms of providing those kinds of opportunities for them. I think that we have to find ways to engage students more in terms of their learning through project-based learning, opportunities for critical thinking, exposure to technology, and technology in a much more creative way in terms of learning. I think that we have to find ways to integrate their culture, their interests, and their strengths into what we do in terms of school programming. And one of the ways that we can do that is through a focus on culturally responsive pedagogy. I think that needs to be one thing that we need to really implement in terms of our schools. And relationships, focusing on caring relationships with kids and removing the deficit thinking that oftentimes guide our behaviors and decisions about what we need to do for kids. There's an old saying that I have that I've kind of lived by throughout not only my personal career with students, or professional career with students, and I've always said kids don't learn from people that they don't like, and adults don't either. So relationships are very important in terms of making sure that kids are provided with the best instruction and the best curriculum that we have to offer them. I always try to keep a kind of a positive kind of an outlook and all of the possibilities that we have for building a renewed society. But I think that until we begin to integrate the larger society and begin to deal with issues of race, that we will not have integrated schools. Schools reflect the values of the larger society, and they mirror the values that are reflected in the larger society. And so I think that we need to talk more about how race affects all of our lives, and we need to begin to break the silence around some of those issues. We need to have integrated communities in order to have integrated schools.